us to criticize the ancient Jews and their practices around food. And it seems like every time we turn around in the Gospels, they're criticizing Jesus for breaking the traditions and about who he eats with and what he eats and how he eats. And again, it'd be so easy for us to say, they're getting it all wrong. How can they worry about those human things and not the divine? But I'd like to maybe have a little bit of fun and hold a mirror up to ourselves and realize that 2,000 years later, we have just as many rules and hang-ups around food and who we eat with and what we eat and how we eat. So this last week was the first week of school, or maybe for some kids it starts this week. And I think the most nerve-wracking part of starting a new school year was always for me the lunch period. And not because the food in the cafeteria wasn't going to be good or, what my mom or dad had made for me wasn't going to work. But in lunch, you had to pick where you were going to sit. And so you got to basically see this whole social hierarchy unfold. And there were certain tables where the cool kids sat, and then there were other tables. I sat at the other tables. And again, there were all sorts of rules. Like, I knew that I couldn't sit at certain tables, and other people weren't going to sit at my table. Again, there were all sorts of hang-ups about who could sit where, unwritten rules. And I think this is most prevalent, say, in the middle or high school cafeteria when it all has to be decided right then and there. But we know this throughout our lives. There are all sorts of rules about who gets to eat with who and so forth. And what? Oh my, there are so many rules about what we can eat and so much judgment. And one of the unwritten rules of being a young parent is that you sort of play this game. And the game is you want to see which child eats the most vegetables. So you go up to other parents and you sort of almost have this conversation that's meant to be just fun, but really you want to show off. You have convinced your child now to eat, peas or carrots or broccoli or avocado or whatever else. And in fact, if you can get your child to eat a vegetable that you don't eat, that's kind of like a double bonus for you. But what ends up happening then is inevitably families and parents, you kind of feel a little bit ashamed then when finally the other parent says, rutabaga or some other vegetable. And you're like, nope, my kid won't do that one. Nope, can't do it. Now, ironically, we all know that by age of 3, no matter how much avocado and tofu and alfalfa sprouts your kid ate at 1, by age 3, they're going to be eating chicken nuggets, hot dogs, and Cheerios, right? But again, you get to brag about it when your kid is 1. So again, there's all this sort of ways in which you sort of feel the social dynamics around what you're allowed to eat. For instance, some of you will have not eaten at a McDonald's in years. I wouldn't do that. Others of you, for instance, wouldn't be caught dead in a Chick-fil-A, and others of you religiously will go there. Yeah, you keep going down the list. Others of you will never stop at Stouffer's of Kissel Hill, or now just Stouffer's, because it's a little bit too bougie. Let's be honest about all of that. There are all sorts of rules we have about where we're allowed to eat and what it says about our virtue, our values, our money, even our politics in today's world. Again, we're just as caught up in gamesmanship and rules and shame around what we eat and what we don't eat. All of us at some point have looked at what somebody else ordered at a restaurant and said, I can't believe they did that. And it's not only then about who we eat, but even how we eat. Now, of course, we want to wash our hands and do all of that today. And we're kind of obsessed with the cleanliness of restaurants, right? I mean, how many of you admit to looking in the paper and seeing what places have violated their sanitary codes? But even more than that, it really gets down to sort of how it has been grown. And there becomes a whole flourishing of words around food to table, organic, natural, non-GMO. The list goes on. Fed, grass, beef, whatever, prayed over by Tibetan monks who were upside down while reverse incanting Zen, whatever. I mean, again, there are so many things we have about what the food is. And eventually, wherever there are rules, there will always be hypocrisy and judgment. was talking to some other parents, and one of them was sort of acknowledging sort of concerns about eating meat, and then this just led to something, this realization and acknowledgement that, well, beef isn't necessarily good for the environment, but what if it's local beef? Is that better than eating vegetables that are shipped in from halfway around the world, and the ethics of different farmers in different countries? And like, whoa, just kind of gets overwhelming. I think for many of us, we acknowledge that our food is ground zero for a lot of rules and even shame. That we don't eat what we should, and that we don't eat in ways that are fair to the earth or fair to the poor or fair to whomever. So again, food, I think for many of us, we're just like those Jews and Pharisees 2,000 years ago, caught up in a whole bunch of rules that just add up to a whole shame burger that we're eating all the time about our food. So what's maybe a way forward? Do we just kind of write off food altogether, or really say that it doesn't matter at all? I think that's hard for most of us. To get at a possible way forward, I want to think about another kind of category, another term, and I want to offer you the term spiritual calorie. Now, physical calorie, we can actually measure, right? It's the amount that will raise one amount of water by 1 degree Celsius, right? And you have to ingest calories and your body consumes them. I'd like to offer that there's spiritual calories, because there are certain things in life that they take something from us spiritually. Again, they sort of eat away at our spiritual health. They demand spiritual food. And I'm thinking about, like the time this week you had to have a really hard conversation with a loved one. And maybe it didn't end up well. And just how drained you felt afterward. I'm thinking about times when you go through job changes, where suddenly like the job has increased in stress, or you find out that you lost a job. Or the way in which I see so many people who are caregiving for loved ones over not just a month, but weeks or years, or even the reality of death and grief. All of these demand something from us. They extract a spiritual price from us. But what happens is that sort of like when there's young athletes in a new sports season, how they have to recalibrate, right, how many calories they're eating to match their new sort of intensity. What often happens in life, though, is that we don't realize how many spiritual calories we're actually burning. How just intense and emotionally demanding life has become for us. And because, again, we're not trained to think like that, we often end up just spiritually starving. Just drained, and we've depleted our reserves. And when this happens, we start to feel disconnected. We feel disconnected from ourselves, our body, and even others, and finally God. And what also happens is that the things that used to kind of work for us, because this is really what happens in life. You're floating along and you're kind of doing okay. And like whatever your balance of going to church or praying or whatever Bible study or friend group or podcast you have, and like it's kind of working and you're kind of moving along. And then again, life happens. And then suddenly you find that the stuff that used to fill you up, well, it turns out you've got this gaping hole in your spiritual kind of tank, and it's just gushing out. Again, you're consuming, you're just churning through spiritual calories, and you're on empty, and whatever you were doing to replenish just isn't working. That run that used to give you 8 hours of relaxation, suddenly after 20 minutes, you already feel it in your neck, and you're just so tight. So we all get to these points, and I want to humbly offer that in our life, our physical calorie consumption goes down, but our spiritual calorie consumption goes up. It's not linear, but that's kind of the pattern of life. And so you have probably found yourself, and maybe you find yourself today at this point saying, what was working isn't working anymore. And I feel really, really spiritually hungry. Well, that's common, because that's life. That's life. And so now I want to go back to physical food. The whole set of laws around kosher that the ancient and modern Jews follow, this whole set of laws was intended to help God's people so that their eating and their consuming of food was not simply about getting calories efficiently or cheaply or tastily. The whole kind of point of all of these laws was so that when they ate, it was also feeding them spiritually. The whole point of all of these laws that God set up was not just, again, for basic sanitary conditions, but was so that when people ate physically, they were fed spiritually. Now, again, because we're humans, we took that law 2,000 years ago, and they took it and they made it legalistic, and they made it judgmental, and they made it about shame. And that is what we do with laws. But I want to invite you to consider, what are ways in which in your life that eating might again become not just about physical nourishment, but about spiritual nourishment as well? Again, what are ways in which eating can become not just this epicenter of shame and frustration and guilt, but can actually become a moment where you recognize God's goodness for you, and you taste and see that indeed the Lord is good? And there's all sorts of ways that that might be able to happen. For instance, it could be as simple as like planting a little basil plant. And that way you could, every now and then sprinkle some of the basil over your food and be reminded of kind of where the fruit of the earth is coming from. Get connected to your food, volunteer at the little farm or something. Or maybe it's about taking a meal and somehow giving something up. And this is especially during Lent, we'll encourage this, but to think about a way, how can I make it so that my eating of food is somehow connected to the poor having the food that they need? And maybe again, thinking about what are practices around how I can give food away to other people. Maybe it's about you eat alone a lot. A lot of us, especially in a busy life or in a life in which there's tons of people that live alone, we eat alone. And that's fine, but maybe we want to find a way to eat with somebody else once a week over Zoom or in person or over the phone. Or maybe it's really simple. Like maybe it's so simple as we just need to take time before we eat and to pray. And maybe even just maybe, it's as simple as just taking a breath. Be still and know that I am the Lord. Just having that verse over in our head. So that again, when we eat, it's not simply about doing so as quickly, as efficiently, as cheaply, as healthily as possible, but it's really about taking time and receiving the goodness of God and being reminded of God's abundance and God's goodwill for us. Now again, as humans, if we do this, some of them will work, some of them won't, and there's a temptation that we might develop pride in the practice, and that can happen. Maybe we need to risk that. But what's really wonderful is that even if we don't kind of get it right, the reason why I'm not willing to give up on the connection of the physical and the spiritual calories is because Jesus doesn't. Right before Jesus has this sort of attack, the story before, he's feeding 5,000 people. And we just heard all throughout the summer of Jesus' offering that he's the bread of life. And he's going to teach us to pray in the most holy of prayers for our daily bread. And finally, it's going to be at a meal that he's going to reveal the new covenant given and shed in his blood. And he every week feeds us with the bread and the wine, his body and his blood, that we would know that finally at least one meal a week isn't about dwelling in shame and guilt and frustration, but is really about receiving his mercy, his love, and his abiding presence with us. So my hope, again, is that you can find a way for the physical and the spiritual to become one as you break bread throughout the week. But know that even if you can't, or even if that's a struggle, that here today Jesus has done that for you as he's given and shed for you and for the forgiveness of your sins. Amen.